Welcome to the Podkey summary of find and fix performance issues in your Metal games from WWDC 2026. Today's story is really about a gap developers have lived with for a while. You can see performance problems while you're playing, but figuring out exactly why they happen later has been the hard part. Apple's newer Metal tools are trying to close that gap with long-running trace capture, a command line workflow, and a way to label what was happening in the game when performance changed. And once that context shows up in traces, in instruments, and even in MetricKit from real player devices, performance debugging starts looking a lot less like guesswork. The Metal Performance HUD still does the immediate practical thing really well. You get live overlays for frame rate, memory, and frame interval during playtesting. So if a scene is obviously struggling, you'll notice fast. The catch is that it's moment-to-moment only. It doesn't persist the data. So in a long session, you can't come back an hour later and say, right there, that exact frame drop happened when this system changed. That limitation matters because a lot of the worst issues aren't the ones that show up in the first 2 minutes. They show up after heat builds, settings change, or a player wanders into some complicated corner of the game. That's where the look-back tracing approach comes in. On macOS and iOS, Metal performance and resource usage can be recorded continuously with aggregated per-frame metrics stored for days. So instead of remembering to start a capture before the interesting part happens, developers can finish the long play session first and pull the data afterward. On iOS, there's a little bit of setup once in developer settings to enable look-back collection. After that, a Control Center button processes the trace and sends it over to a Mac for analysis, which is a lot nicer than trying to perfectly time manual captures every single run. There's also a new command line tool, Metal Perf Trace, on macOS 27. And this is one of those additions that quietly makes a lot of workflows cleaner. It can collect a trace with a simple collect last command and a duration. Or it can work from explicit start and end timestamps. The important part is that it doesn't need extra configuration just to do the basic job. And it can generate JSON overviews, which means scripts can parse the results automatically. If a team wants to flag a regression, compare builds, or even have an AI agent triage performance reports, there's now structured data to work with instead of just eyeballing graphs and hoping for the best. Raw FPS numbers are helpful, but they're often missing the most human question, which is, what was the game doing at that time? State reporting is meant to answer that. It lets developers define domains, basically finite state machines for separate aspects of the game, like level progression, graphics settings, or network status. Each domain emits labeled states and can attach metadata, with stable metadata for things that persist and volatile metadata for values that change more often. The API is available in Swift and Objective-C, and those state changes can show up directly in the HUD, in Metal Perf Trace output, and in instruments tracks. Once those states are in the trace, the analysis gets much more concrete. Metal Perf Trace can aggregate metrics like FPS or GPU usage for a specific state label. So instead of saying performance seemed bad, sometimes a developer can see something like an average FPS of 24, specifically when the graphics domain was in the high state. If they include state transitions in the output, they also get timestamps for when each state changed. That makes it much easier to line up a dip with a graphics toggle, a level transition, or some network condition that only happens partway through a session. This also flows into instruments in a pretty natural way. When a trace includes state reporting data, Instruments automatically creates a points of interest track for each domain. So you get a visual timeline of state transitions and volatile metadata over time, instead of trying to reconstruct the story from memory. And if you select a state in the sidebar, you can inspect the stable and volatile metadata right there. That makes it much easier to verify that a frame rate drop really did line up with a graphics setting change, rather than blaming the wrong system because the timing felt suspicious. There are some best practices here, and they're worth paying attention to because bad instrumentation can get messy fast. Domains should stay conceptually orthogonal and limited in number. If one domain tries to represent too many dimensions at once, analysis gets confusing because the labels stop telling a clear story. And state transitions need to be throttled to something closer to user action cadence. If transitions fire too frequently, the system can throttle them, and then the information you really needed may be the information that gets lost, which is a very annoying way to learn moderation. This doesn't stop at lab testing. MetricKit delivers daily in-process reports from players' devices, including aggregated metal frame rate data and a breakdown by state reporting states. So after launch, developers can monitor how performance behaves in the wild on real devices across real play patterns. MetricKit also includes diagnostics like memory exception traces, which can help identify the exact code path behind a termination caused by resource limits. That's a big deal, because some of the ugliest failures are the ones that only show up outside the tidy little universe of internal testing. Starting with iOS and macOS 27, the operating system continuously records metal performance metrics in the background. That means developers no longer have to manually start a trace every time they want useful data. Paired with MetricKit, it creates a more seamless long-term view of performance without putting extra burden on the user experience. And that's really the larger theme here. The tools are shifting from short, deliberate captures toward continuous visibility. The recommended workflow is pretty sensible. Playtest on different devices, collect long-duration traces, analyze the aggregated metrics, add state reporting where the trace needs more context, and then iterate. That matters especially for issues like thermal throttling, graphic setting changes, or level transitions, because those variables often only reveal themselves over extended sessions. A game can look fine in a quick test and still fall apart 40 minutes later, which is honestly a very game-like way for a bug to hide. The big improvement here is that performance data is no longer just a snapshot. It's becoming a timeline with context attached. And once developers can see not only that performance dipped, but what state the game was in when it dipped, the path to a fix gets a lot shorter. This episode was generated by Podkey. Create your own at podkey.fm.